Welcome to Infinite Universe with interesting episode. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel first met when they were only 11 years old. They were just kids in Queens, New York, when Paul saw Art perform at a fourth-grade talent show. They didn't become close right away, but by sixth grade, they began talking more during a school play of Alice in Wonderland. Paul played the White Rabbit, and Art was the Cheshire Cat. Art thought Paul was really smart and funny, maybe the most interesting boy in school. Soon, they discovered they both loved music, especially the new rock and roll songs they heard on the radio. They started hanging out more, listening to music, and trying to sing together. With a few other kids, they formed a little singing group called the Peptones. They loved practicing harmonies and learning how their voices could blend. Eventually, Paul and Art began performing as a duo at school events. By the time they were 15, in 1957, they decided to record a song called Hey Schoolgirl. They managed to gather $25 and went to Sanders Recording Studio in Manhattan. As luck would have it, a music promoter named Sid Prosen heard their song and liked it. He convinced their parents to let him sign them to his independent label, Big Records. They started calling themselves Tom and Jerry, inspired by the cartoon. Their song got played by a well-known DJ and became a hit. It sold over 100,000 copies and even made it onto the Billboard charts. They appeared on American Bandstand, a big deal at the time. But their success didn't last. Follow-up songs didn't do well, and people lost interest. Still, it gave them a taste of what could be possible in the music world. Their relationship wasn't always easy, even in those early days. In 1958, something happened that Art never forgot. After graduating from high school, they both went off to college. Paul studied English at Queen's College, and Art started in architecture at Columbia University before switching to art history. They were still signed to Big Records and still using their Tom and Jerry stage names. Art used the name Tom Graff, and Paul called himself Jerry Landis. Then, Paul did something that hurt Art deeply. Without telling him, Paul recorded and released a solo single using a fake name, True Taylor. The song, True or False, came out in secret. When Art found out, he felt completely betrayed. That feeling of betrayal would come up again and again over the years. Even many years later, Paul admitted that memory still bothered him. He especially remembered the time when Art said to him, "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you," a comment that stuck with Paul. Years passed, and by the early 1960s, folk music was becoming more popular in America. This gave Paul and Art a reason to try working together again. In 1963, 5 years after their original break, they began performing again under the name Kane and Gar. They played in small clubs around Greenwich Village, such as Judd's Folk City. One night, they caught the attention of Tom Wilson, a respected African-American jazz musician and producer. Wilson had helped Bob Dylan move from folk to rock, and he saw something unique in Paul and Art. He got them a studio audition, and they played The Sound of Silence, a song Paul had written in his bathroom with the lights off and water running to set the mood. They signed with Columbia Records using their real names, Simon and Garfunkel. It was perfect timing. Folk music was getting more emotional and poetic, and Paul's songwriting was improving. But their first album, Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., released in October 1964, was a failure. It only sold about 3,000 copies. The label called it exciting new sounds in the folk tradition, but the timing was off. British bands like the Beatles were taking over with electric guitars, and the album felt outdated. Most of the songs weren't even Paul's originals. Disappointed, Paul moved to England to work on a solo career, and Art went back to Columbia University to study math. It looked like the end of Simon and Garfunkel. While in London, Paul recorded a solo album. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened back in the US. In spring 1965, some college radio stations in places like Boston and Florida started playing The Sound of Silence. Tom Wilson noticed and decided to remix it without telling Paul or Art. He added electric guitar, bass, and drums to the original version. But the original song had tempo problems, and the studio musicians had a hard time keeping the rhythm. The engineer, Roy Haley, used echo effects to cover the uneven timing. While Paul was in Denmark, He found out that the remixed song was becoming a hit in the US. When he finally heard it, he didn't like it. He thought it sounded strange and messy. But the public disagreed. The song climbed the charts and reached number 1 on January 1, 1966. Suddenly, Simon and Garfunkel were famous. They had to quickly reunite and record a new album to keep up with the momentum. That album, Sounds of Silence, came out in early 1966. In October of the same year, they released their third album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme. This was a major turning point. It stayed on the Billboard charts for nearly 3 years and sold over 3 million copies. For the first time, they used an 8-track recording system, which allowed them to record cleanly and layer their vocals without Paul's guitar bleeding into the mic. This gave their music a smoother, more polished sound. However, not everything was perfect behind the scenes. Some songs caused controversy. For example, Scarborough Fair was based on an old English folk song that Paul had learned from a musician named Martin Carthy. Even though it was a traditional song, the album only credited Simon and Garfunkel. Another song, Cloudy, was co-written with Bruce Woodley of the Seekers. Although Woodley was paid, he didn't get credit on the album. Still, the album was a huge success. Years later, it was added to the Grammy Hall of Fame and listed by Rolling Stone as one of the greatest albums of all time. In June 1967, Simon and Garfunkel performed at the Monterey Pop Festival. It was a big cultural event featuring famous artists like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who. While many performers smashed guitars or lit them on fire, Simon and Garfunkel were calm and thoughtful. Their gentle folk sound reminded people of simpler times. Some critics thought their style wasn't as exciting as the psychedelic rock happening around them, but their performance still stood out. They proved they had a place in the changing music world. That same year, something surprising happened that would change both their lives and the way music was used in movies. Director Mike Nichols was working on the film The Graduate and had the idea to use Simon and Garfunkel's songs instead of a traditional score. Paul had agreed to write 3 new songs for the movie, but touring got in the way. Instead, the film editor used existing songs like The Sound of Silence and Scarborough Fair while editing scenes. The music fit so well with the film that they decided to keep it. The movie and the music helped each other succeed. The soundtrack became a major hit, even competing with the Beatles on the charts. One new song, Mrs. Robinson, won Record of the Year. Their music gave the movie emotional depth, and the movie gave Simon and Garfunkel a larger audience, including older listeners. Their soundtrack work inspired future filmmakers to use popular music in movies in new and powerful ways. But even with all this success, problems between Paul and Art started growing. Their working relationship became more one-sided. Paul was writing all the songs and handling most of the creative decisions. Art mainly focused on singing. Paul noticed during recording sessions that Art would often sit in the control room and give feedback while Paul did the hard work. Paul admitted he started to feel resentful. He got jealous when crowds cheered for ARTs singing on songs like Bridge Over Troubled Water, even though Paul had written the lyrics and music. He remembered thinking, I wrote that song, but Art gets the applause. That feeling went back to childhood. Paul remembered his mom once telling him, you have a good voice, Paul, but Arthur has a fine voice. It hurt. As time passed, the tension between them grew. Art didn't contribute to songwriting and sometimes seemed distant, while Paul felt more and more frustrated. In January 1969, they began working on what would be their final album. At the same time, both of them were cast in the movie Catch-22, directed by Mike Nichols. But something unexpected happened. Paul's role was cut from the movie, and ART's part remained. Filming began in Guaymas, Mexico, on January 13th, and Art left to work on the film while Paul stayed behind in New York. He felt abandoned and hurt. Director Charles Grodin later said this was the beginning of the end for Simon and Garfunkel. Taking only one of them and dropping the other created a huge emotional rift that would never fully heal. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel weren't just a musical duo. They were best friends who met when they were just 11 years old, growing up in the same neighborhood in Queens, New York. They started singing together as kids, standing on street corners and performing in school plays. Their voices blended like they were made for each other. Even then, they felt something special. They called themselves Tom and Jerry in their early days, performing simple pop songs that showed off their harmony. But no one could have guessed how famous they would become or how painful their story would turn out to be. As they got older, music became their life. In the 1960s, they hit it big with songs that touched people deeply. Paul Simon wrote the lyrics and music, and Art Garfunkel brought them to life with his smooth, emotional voice. Together, they created magic. Songs like The Sound of Silence, Mrs. Robinson, and Bridge Over Troubled Water didn't just top the charts, they became part of the culture. Their music gave voice to a generation searching for meaning, peace, and change during a time of war and unrest. But underneath the harmonies, tension was growing. Quietly. Slowly. And it never really went away. One of the biggest cracks in their partnership came in 1969. Garfunkel had been offered a role in a film called Catch-22. He told Simon he'd be away for 6 weeks to shoot it in Mexico. But those 6 weeks turned into months. While Garfunkel was gone chasing a movie career, Simon was left behind, trying to finish their next album. It wasn't just about the music. To Simon, it felt like his best friend had chosen something else, someone else over him. It hurt more than he let on at the time. Later, in the 2024 documentary In Restless Dreams, Simon talked about how betrayed he felt. He recalled telling Garfunkel, "Actually, no, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to do that." Garfunkel had planned to act in movies for part of the year and then return to make albums. But Simon couldn't accept that anymore. He was already doing most of the work, writing the songs, leading the recording sessions, crafting the sound. Garfunkel's role had become mostly about singing and giving feedback from the control room. It no longer felt like a true partnership. As Garfunkel stayed in Mexico, the situation only got worse. Long-distance collaboration didn't work. Simon would send songs, and Garfunkel would send back comments. But it wasn't the same. It didn't feel like they were creating together anymore. Some songs Simon finished alone. On others, Garfunkel's voice was barely there or missing entirely. One song, The Only Living Boy in New York, was Simon's way of expressing how alone he felt. He used their old stage names, Tom and Jerry, in the lyrics. Tom, get your plane right on time. It was about Garfunkel flying off to Mexico, leaving Simon behind with the music and the silence. Even when they performed together, things were off. One performance that stuck with Simon for years was when they sang Bridge Over Troubled Water live. Every time Garfunkel reached the powerful climax of the song, the crowd went wild with cheers. They gave him a standing ovation. But in Simon's heart, a bitter thought kept coming back. I wrote that song. He had given Garfunkel the lead vocals on purpose, believing his voice was perfect for it. But it still stung. People were celebrating the voice they heard, not the man who had written the words and melody. And it wasn't just the audience, critics, too, always seemed to praise Garfunkel more. That feeling of being overshadowed went back to Simon's childhood. He remembered something his mother once said, "You have a good voice, Paul, but Arthur has a fine voice." It was a simple sentence, but to Simon, it left a deep scar. Every time someone praised Garfunkel's singing, that childhood memory came back like a wound being reopened. Even in the height of their success, he felt like second best. Garfunkel, too, had his struggles. In later interviews, he admitted that Simon had always been in the way. He had wanted to write songs too, but he never did because he felt he couldn't compete. Simon was such a powerful songwriter, Garfunkel didn't even try. For years, he kept that feeling to himself. It was only decades later that he started writing and releasing his own music. He later asked in the documentary, "Was I the one who broke up the group, or was it Paul who never made room for me?" It was a painful question, but an honest one. Eventually, even Simon admitted that their partnership was never equal. He was the one writing the songs, choosing the arrangements, leading the sessions. Garfunkel mostly gave feedback or approval. It had worked for a while, but not forever. During the making of Bridge Over Troubled Water, their differences became impossible to ignore. When Garfunkel left for the movie, the album was delayed. Simon felt abandoned. Their emotional distance was growing, just like the physical one between New York and Mexico. Then, in the summer of 1970, at Forest Hill Stadium in Queens, they gave what would be their last performance as a duo. The crowd didn't know it at the time. There was no big announcement. No dramatic argument. But something had quietly ended that night. They said goodbye backstage, and that was it. No long talk. No explanation. With Artie, there was no reason to talk about it, Simon said years later. That sentence says everything. They didn't need to speak it out loud because deep down, they both knew it was over. After the split, their lives took very different paths. Paul Simon threw himself into his solo career with everything he had. He didn't just survive, he soared. His early albums were full of creative energy and new sounds. Songs like Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard and 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover became hits. People saw he wasn't just half of Simon and Garfunkel. He was a brilliant artist on his own. In 1986, he released Graceland, an album that combined South African rhythms with his own style. It was revolutionary. It won Grammy Awards and sold millions. It changed what pop music could be. Art Garfunkel had a harder time. His voice was still beautiful, still powerful, but his solo music didn't find the same audience. He released albums, but none reached the level of what he and Simon had done together. Fans loved him, but the spotlight didn't follow him. Oddly, his acting career went better. He got good reviews for his roles in Catch-22 and Carnal Knowledge. Even Simon admitted feeling bitter about that. He talked about how everyone seemed to say Artie had so much talent, so much feeling, and yes, how handsome he was. That bothered Simon more than he liked to admit. But their breakup wasn't just a personal fight. It reflected a bigger change in the world. In the 1960s, their music was the voice of a generation that believed in peace, love, and revolution. But by 1970, that era was ending. The protests, the unity, the hope, it was all starting to fade. People were turning inward. The songs that once echoed through college campuses and peace marches were being replaced by something else. Bridge Over Troubled Water was more than an album. It was a farewell to a time, a moment, a feeling. Still, their story didn't end in silence. In 1975, they came back together for a song called My Little Town. But even that was strange. Instead of recording as a duo, they each put the song on their own solo albums. It was a reunion, but not a warm one. Simon even told Garfunkel he wrote it to give him something darker to sing, because he thought Artie's solo music was too sweet. They performed it on Saturday Night Live, but then they went their separate ways again. The distance between them stayed the same. In 1981, they reunited for something huge, a free concert in Central Park. 500,000 people showed up. It was one of the biggest concerts in American history. They sang together like old times, playing 21 songs under the night sky. Fans loved it. The energy was electric. The event led to a world tour. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. Garfunkel said it was thrilling to be on stage again. But Simon admitted they barely spoke during the tour. They were together on stage, but not in real life. Then came the most painful moment of all. In 1983, they began working on a new album together called Think Too Much. Garfunkel recorded his vocals carefully, piece by piece. But Simon lost patience. One day, without warning, he called Garfunkel and said he was removing his voice from the album. An engineer later confirmed it. Every trace of Garfunkel's voice was wiped from the tapes. The album came out as a Paul Simon solo project, now called Hearts and Bones. Garfunkel's work survived only on bootlegs. That betrayal was deep. It wasn't just about music, it was personal. By the 1990s, things had gotten even worse. In 1993, they tried to perform together again in New York, but everything collapsed. A critic called Garfunkel just one of many collaborators, and it set him off. Backstage, there was shouting, shoving, real anger. One of Simon's business managers even said he was afraid someone might get stabbed. These weren't young men anymore. They were in their 50s. But the pain they carried was still fresh. And maybe that's the saddest part. Two boys who once sang on street corners, who created some of the most beautiful music in American history, were still trapped in the same old wounds. Simon never forgot how Garfunkel once teased him, "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you." It sounds like a joke. But to Simon, who already struggled with insecurities and years of therapy, it wasn't funny. It was painful. Deep down, he always felt small next to Garfunkel, not just in height, but in the way people saw them. Their story is one of music, yes. But it's also about friendship, pride, jealousy, and loss. A love that turned to bitterness. A partnership that couldn't survive its own brilliance. And though they reunited for shows here and there, including another Central Park performance in 2003, their bond was never quite healed. Their songs remain timeless. But the story behind them is full of hurt that even the most beautiful harmony couldn't fix. Thanks for watching. Keep it and stay tuned. Like and subscribe our channel. Have a good day.